should be able to tell their own story in their own words. That people, the way in which we as individuals and communities, the way in which we engage with the world, interpret the world and respond to the world, that this differs greatly and that these differences should be respected and should be given a place. And that being the case, I think it's a very important corrective to historical emancipatory discourses. So liberalism in its time was revolutionary, but liberalism pursued the universalism. Not loud enough, sorry. As you know, Seppo, I'm a very shy person, so I have to be encouraged to talk a little louder. So liberalism in its own time was quite revolutionary, and liberalism saw louder again. Yeah, I'll start singing in a minute. Liberalism, as I say, in its own time was quite revolutionary, and liberalism universalized the rights of the white property-owning man. And in its own time, liberalism and this universality of liberalism was radical. Marxism was, of course, radical in its own time, but Marxism again fetishized the white working class, the white industrial working class of Western Europe in the first instance. And Marxism in its dominant forms certainly had a lot of blind spots when it came to questions of gender, of race, of indigeneity and so forth. So what post-colonialism does is it forces an important corrective and forces a debate with these older emancipatory narratives, and in that sense it's really important. And post-colonialism stresses specificity and difference and lower that? Okay. As I say, everybody should be able to tell their story in their own words. So in this sense, post-colonialism is very important. Now, what a number of the speakers have mentioned already, and what I'm sure others will say later, is the important role post-colonialism plays in decolonising our mental space. So it's all well and good, the Portuguese withdrew their armies, but they left a legacy behind which Brazilian society is still dealing with. It's the same in Ireland. The British withdrew their armies, or we forced them to withdraw their armies, but then the traditions and the legacy and the intellectual mores which they established persist. So the Irish system of government is a very poor imitation of the British system of government. Irish conceptions of the role of the state and so forth draw on what we learned from the British. Even our language, I speak English. We have a native language, and I know some words in it, but I think after 2 nights in Porto Alegre, I know more Portuguese than I know of Gaelic. So, you know, we have our own language, but all of this was forced out. So, the post-colonialism performed this important track, but criticising ideas is always a criticism of the social relations which give rise to those ideas. So we're not just criticising ideas for their own sake. When we criticise the colonial legacy and the ideas which they create, we're also criticising the social relations which reproduce these ideas. And so that brings me on to what I want to talk about as total capitalism. I borrow this term from a guy called Colin Lees, and he's written a book about total capitalism. And what do I mean by total capitalism? Well, effectively, capitalism as a system is far more entrenched and far more ubiquitous now than it ever was at any point in the history of capitalism. There's an important book recently called 24/7 by Jonathan Grary, and it shows how in America they're conducting very serious research to develop drugs that mean we don't need sleep. So capitalism is becoming so ubiquitous that actually it's invading every aspect of our life space. And global capitalism now is this system of total capitalism, where every aspect of life is subject to the logic of market reproduction, subject to the logic of profit, and subject to the logic of exchange for profit. And to that extent, all of us, to one degree or another, are market actors within global capitalism. So this is a totalizing system. Now, we can rightly contest totalizing and universalizing narratives, but whether you like it or not, capitalism is a totalizing system. In much the case, if you didn't believe in gravity, it still wouldn't stop a block falling on your head. You know, so whether or not you want to subscribe to this idea of a totalizing narrative, capitalism is a totalizing system. And each and every one of us is drawn into its logic. And the logic of capitalism results in various ways in the fundamental denial of what we're also here to talk about today, which is human rights. Now, human rights is a hotly contested and highly contestable term, and rightly so. But we all have some sense of what we mean when we talk about human rights. People should have the right to express themselves freely, to sort of coordinate with people that they have shared interests with. For me, people should have the right to decent housing, healthcare, all of these various things. So we have some sense of what we mean by human rights. And the system of total capitalism, while its liberal apologists claim promotes human rights, actually by its very nature undermines human rights. This system of total capitalism leads to, directly or indirectly, the denial of the entire corpus of human rights. The immiseration of people, the entrenchment of poverty and inequality, and all of the human rights denying consequences which this has. So, post-colonialism is important in emphasizing specificity and difference, but in terms of resistance, in terms of actually confronting the problems created by this economic system, what we need is also unity. Because if we're all siphoned off and broken off into our discrete categories with our discrete concerns, this totalizing system will marginalize each and every one of us as communities and as individuals and break us down. So what I'm arguing is that post-colonialism is valuable and important, but also in the current political economy in which we exist, we need to talk about solidarities. We need to. So Enrique Dussel, in a recent enough piece, his 20 thesis on politics, he makes the point that yes, we have to respect and understand all of these differences, but through our shared militant praxis, we can develop what he calls an allegoric hegemon. So that even with our differences, we can definitely come together and build alliances and build strategies to resist this system. And I want to argue that oppressed peoples of the world, irrespective of gender, race, nationality, and so forth, that there's an intuitive solidarity there. There's an intuitive solidarity. And to give some examples, some small examples, the Choctaw Nation, who was a Native American tribe from North America, from what's now called the United States. The Choctaw Nation in the early 19th century were forced to move from the southern states of the US up to north of Mississippi, to the northern states. Along the way, they lost half of their population. Half of the people died as this forced migration by the American government. And they call this the Trail of Tears, where they lost half their population. 2 years later, in Ireland, when we were still very much a formal British colony, we experienced what's called a famine. Now, the famine is a bit of a misnomer, because the famine implies there was no food. There was lots of food, but was sent to England to pay taxes and pay rent for land. The potato crop failed, and most Irish people lived on the potato because it was the cheapest form of food, easiest to produce, and so forth. So in Ireland, we say, God made the potato blight, he made the disease that killed the potatoes, but the English made the famine. There was food, but the food went to England. So there's a famous story of a French ship full of aid coming into Galway port to deliver food to the poor starving Irish, and seeing 5 ships full of food going the other way to pay taxes in England. So 2 years after the Choctaw people lost half of their population at the hands of white people, they heard about the famine in Ireland, and they sent money to help the poor Irish people. So this again is, irrespective of their nationality, irrespective of their race, they had this intuitive solidarity. Another example, a little closer to the part of the war we're in now, was when, during the Mexican-American War, there was a brigade of Irish soldiers who had joined the American Army to get citizenship, much like lots of people from Latin America going to America do now, join the American Army to get citizenship. And they fought against the Mexicans, but during the course of the conflict, these Irish realised, hang on, we're on the side of the oppressors, we should be fighting with the Mexicans, and they switched sides. And because they were so familiar with American tactics, they inflicted serious damage on the American military. And when they signed a peace agreement between Mexico and America, one thing the Americans insisted on was that the Brigada San Patricio had to be handed over, and they were executed. There's a square in Mexico City, I believe, named after them. When the Americans invaded the Philippines, around the time that they took Cuba and Puerto Rico also, a number of African American soldiers who were in the American Army realized again, we're on the wrong side, and they joined the Filipino resistance against the Americans in the Philippines. More recently, people in Taksim Square in Egypt, where they were resisting an authoritarian government and their own problems, when workers occupied the parliament in Wisconsin, occupied the Senate building, the protesters from Taksim Square sent pizza to the protesters in Wisconsin to show their support. So there's this intuitive solidarity there, and this is what I mean by split with the same axe. When I was a student, when I was an undergraduate student, I used to spend the summer working in construction. And around the time I was doing this, there was a lot of Polish immigration into Ireland, and a lot of Irish people responded to this in a racist way. The Polish are coming here, they're taking their jobs and so forth. And I remember working on a construction site, and this older Irish man, when a younger guy was complaining about the Polish, he said, sure, we're all split with the same axe. At the end of the day, we all die in the same way. You know, we're all split with the same axe. There's an inherent, and this is the problem, there is an inherent humanity, and the humanity of those who suffer, those who are excluded, those who struggle, is a shared humanity. It doesn't have to be homogenous, but it is a universal humanity. And again, the majority of us. So, for example, the guy's name here is Joseph Safra, the Brazilian billionaire. He has an awful lot more in common with Bill Gates than he has with you or me. You know, so these guys, they have a shared solidarity born of their particular position and their particular class status. And we, those who struggle, those who are marginalised, those who suffer under this system of capitalism, with all of our differences and all of our distinctiveness, we have a shared solidarity. So the point I'd make, I suppose it's almost a friendly critique of post-colonialism as a theoretical practice. Because there's this danger that we overemphasise difference, that we place too much emphasis on it. It's important that we respect people's differences and people's traditions, but in terms of actually political strategy and how we combat this system that totalises us all anyway, we have to respond in a unified manner. So that's the essence of what I say, is that we're all split with the same axe. And in order to combat this system, which brutalises and dehumanises and immiserates the vast majority of people on this planet, we need to respect our differences, we need to develop our own languages, we need to completely recalibrate and even reject an awful lot of the heritage of the Enlightenment and articulate our own ways of challenging this system. But we need to do it by stressing solidarity as well. So that's all I'll say.